So it gives me very great pleasure today to be at the stage in our Australian Research Council grant where we are actually launching our website and also engaging in our art exhibition that we've been working on since 2021. So it's been a long and exciting project. And we're very grateful to be at this point now in our development. So I'm just going to share the PowerPoints with everyone, and hopefully that's on the screen as well. And today from the team, we have myself, Catherine Manathanga, we have Professor Maria Rossetti and Dr. Chi Jing from RMIT, who are presenting on behalf of the whole team, which also includes Professor Catherine Gilby, Professor Sue Stanton, and Zhao Tuxworth and Uncle John Wap. So the title of our presentation and our project is Implementing Indigenous Knowledge Approaches in Australian Doctoral Education. So first of all, I would like to do our acknowledgement. So we are meeting today on Gubbi Gubbi country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room and on Zoom. This is a space of age-old ceremony, wisdom and education, and we hope that this rich history and ongoing cultural dynamism will infuse our discussions today. And it's interesting, I'm just back from South Africa, where they really like the idea of acknowledgement of country, which I do over there anyway, and explain why we do it and how it comes from a long tradition. And in our research, one of our African participants had only been in the country for a few weeks, but he was also saying how great it was to have that either welcome to country or acknowledgement of country, and how he felt that that was something that everyone could learn from. So I just wanted to add that on to the acknowledgement today. So, and I'd like to make a very special mention of our ITRC adjunct professor, Sue Stanton, who is our elder on the project. She is a Kangarikan traditional owner, custodian in Bachelor in the Northern Territory. And she sends all the participants today her best wishes. And I think she's joining us online at some point as well. So this is our full deadly research team, as we like to call ourselves, including some Aotearoa New Zealand colleagues, Hinakura Smith, Associate Professor Hinakura Smith, and our South African colleagues, Professor Shireen Motala, Professor Moira Keane, and Dr. Beatrice Akala, who I've just come back from working with in South Africa. And we have a very large two groups, an Elders Advisory Group and a Project Reference Group, some of whom are here today, such as Stella from the Migrant Refugee Centre and many others. But we have been supported by many elders and senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also people from transcultural communities. And we have a long list of Project Reference Group members as well. So we're very grateful to them for their support and guidance throughout the project. So I'll hand over to Maria now. Just do it that way. Just turn this
up. Hi, everybody. Hopefully that's picking up. And look, I really appreciate everybody coming along to share this really momentous occasion. Since 2021, wow. And we've done a lot since then. So probably just to give you an overview of the project itself, which is about why we were doing this and what we were planning to set out and what we actually have achieved, which you'll see the outcomes of from today. So fundamentally, the project was around achieving knowledge justice, and it was centered around 4 key pillars, the work itself. We looked at country, which was a key part of it, and not just being on country, but agency of country and agency on country to inform the way that PhD research is undertaken that helps to nurture and support and even inspire research in this space. So country was a really key part of it, as well as policy. So within the project itself, there was some policy analysis, not just looking at Australia, but also globally. So also involved looking at policy in South Africa, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also in China to better understand what doctoral education looks like, what the constraints are, whether they're, and often, you know, hidden and invisible so that policy analysis gave us a bird's eye view and a global view of knowledge justice. We also then looked at the power of story, which we'll see in the art exhibition coming through very strongly, focusing not only on life histories of our many participants, but also during that process of sharing their life histories, developing, drawing time maps, which were a really important artifact, which we'll see brought forward. And it was great to have this multimodal approach of talking and a tactile element to it. And lastly, the 4th pillar, if you like, was sitting around knowledges itself, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges, and looking at the intercultural, interactive and intergenerational aspects of them, which were themes that we saw coming through in the data analysis as well, with people looking both back in time, talking about their ancestors and their families, as well as looking forward in terms of, you know, their children and their children's children. So this sense of the everyone was very clear coming through as a theme. So there were many parts of it, as you can see in the middle there was the issue, or we took into account elements of geographies of where people were from, but also where they were conducting the research itself, the histories of those places and how they connected with that country where they were. It included cultural practices. Language was a really key part of it. Learning, for example, through our policy analysis that, for example, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, being able to submit and have your work examined in Maori language was a possibility. It was not only that, but it was encouraged, whereas we didn't see that obviously in Australia, not to the full extent that it could be, I should say. And of course, histories of those places. So I think the everyone was present in all of this, looking forwards and backwards and centering ourselves, and it created a really rich and deep, I guess, perspective of doctoral education that isn't, I guess, apparent in the literature to date. So with the policy analysis, the focus on doctoral education for First Nations and transcultural candidates started out with looking at, so these were our publications, weren't they? Sorry. And Indigenous Knowledge Systems Policy Analysis, the first one we conducted with a comparison with South Africa and Australia, again, revealed some really interesting findings in there. But even if we link it back to languages, for example, that there are about 7 official languages in South Africa, and how linguistics actually play into not only the supervision experience where you're communicating and trying to conduct research, but then how it's presented. Is it presented in English, and what does that mean, and how a system's set up around that? But also it was about moving beyond tokenism, as it's got there, and the view that it wasn't, I guess that was a deep and critical understanding of the role of Indigenous knowledge systems. The next thing we looked at too was about the ICOLA report in Australia, and the paper that came out of this looked at the problem of First Nations doctoral education in Australian policy, looking back at that deficit perspective, the problematisation of not enough Indigenous candidates coming through, of their success rate coming out, and then what happened to graduates. So it was looking back to say, well, how has policy positioned Indigenous students in this negative light in the first place? And it was a really interesting finding that, for example, Australian doctoral policy often, or in Australia, we policy borrow from a certain suite of countries, and we often don't go beyond those. And so who we reference ourselves or benchmark ourselves against actually influences the positioning of Indigenous peoples within policy in Australia. And it wasn't just the policy, it was also the implementation of that policy, which was really sort of a part of that process. In the article led by Jing, looked at multilingualism in doctoral education and how this is affecting the experience of Indigenous and transcultural research students having to be required to present and write in English and to engage when you have other languages other than English in this space, and exploring the reasons why that and why it should not be, I guess, is probably the resistance to it that we're putting forward. And it's interesting across this length of time of this project, kicking off with an era in 2021 where there was no ability or flexibility regarding the language that a thesis was submitted in, to more recently now, you do a quick scan of the internet and you can see more and more universities are providing the opportunity for students to submit in a language of their choice with, there's a process with permission, so to speak. So even across this, they're seeing this sort of switching around of it. And even for those of you examining doctoral theses by Indigenous and transcultural people, you'll see more translanguaging happening. And I had the joy of examining a great thesis at the end of last year that was a really good example of a First Nations academic, a scholar using translanguaging, using and integrating their own language. So it was a lesson. It really was, reading that thesis and to have the glossary and to actually learn. By the end of it, I think I was pretty proficient in the words that were being put there. So it was a great experience. The next paper was led by Catherine around population parity and the pursuit of that. So parity is often seen as our benchmark for success, that when we get Indigenous students or transcultural students enrolled to population parity, then we have succeeded. And this was a really critical piece of work because it says, is that enough? Why do we use it and what happens when we reach it? So we can see in the recent accord, for example, that where population parity has been met around certain equity groups, they've literally been dropped in terms of their status as equity groups. So the paper led by Catherine here questions that to say, well, is that enough to redeem previous intergenerational disadvantage, and should it be more than parity? So yeah, parity really is a key metric there. And the last one that's currently we're looking at is around, that's the policy analysis and looking at the policy borrowing between select countries and what that's resulting in. So it may come to shock you, but we don't write all our own policies. We look to other countries abroad. And the most interesting part about that too, I think, is for me, is actually the implementation of the policy, not just the construction of the policy, but the implementation, because they often now go to implementation committees who then actually recast and reframe them in a different light, that it ends up not being, misalignment, I guess, between the two things. And these are our policy analysis publications to date. I won't go through them, but you got the gist, basically, that we've been active in this space. We have more to come as we move forward and as we progress in this sort of last stages of the project itself. I'll hand back to Catherine.
Thanks, Maria. And I did forget to tell you at the beginning that what we've got planned for you today is, first of all, this presentation. Then we're all going to move down to the cave and we're going to have a surround sound, visual and audio presentation. And then there's the art exhibition of the time maps around the windows outside the cave. So apologies for, sorry. And then drinks and nibblies. Inez is doing this, yeah. Okay, the really important part, drinks and nibblies, yeah. So, okay, so back to our research. So as Maria was saying, the power of story is a key pillar of our research, and we were conducting life history interviews and time mapping. So we were seeking to challenge dominant representations of Indigenous and transcultural research students and supervisors, and contest normative notions that underpin Western or Northern doctoral supervision that doesn't take account of the knowledges, histories, geographies, languages and cultural practices of First Nations and transcultural doctoral students and supervisors. And we were also aiming to develop supervision strategies from from this data or these data that would allow Indigenous and transcultural students and supervisors to incorporate all of this rich knowledge. And we were seeking to trace how history and time impact on doctoral students' knowledges, geographies, languages, and cultural practices, and how all of this gives these students a very unique approach to knowledge creation. We were linking this with those pillars of Indigenous knowledge approaches: agency of and on country, power of story, and iterative intergenerational and intercultural knowledge and wisdom. So life histories produce narratives and stories about participants' knowledges and how these knowledges shape their approach to their research, or for the supervisors, to the supervision that they provide. So what we have constructed, we've shaped and analysed the interview data into two main formats. There's some very short case study narratives for website resources. Then there are, in our publications, quotes that we are using for thematic, post-structuralist and post-colonial or decolonial analysis. And sometimes we're working in first person and sometimes in third person or in collective thematic analysis. So that's the approach we're taking there. Time maps was a visual methodology that our pilot group for this project developed. And so it's a visual and oral methodology designed to trace the images and small amounts of text that participants use to explain their histories, geographies, and cultural knowledges. And so it's a diverse form of knowledge generation that goes beyond the dominance of the written word to capture sight, sound, emotion, and other senses. And our one of our PhD students on the project, Zhao Tuxworth, has extended that methodology. She's a music teacher, so she's extended that into music and sound. And her PhD, which is currently under examination, is exploring the particular songs that are really important to transcultural music teachers in Australia and how that has shaped their identity and their approach to teaching in the school sector. So that methodology has proved to be quite versatile. And so we'll just hand over to Jean now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I might as well just stand here, I think, or maybe here. All right. We did a lot of data collection. So overall, we interviewed 105 participants who produced 41 time maps. So in terms of rows, there are 43 PhD candidates and 57 PhD supervisors, and 5 with unclear rows. But having said that, a lot of the PhD supervisors were originally, international students here. So they had a lot to say. And also a lot of them were young PhD students. Like they had a lot to say about, their own doctoral experience and how they carried that as part of their intellectual history into their PhD supervision, which was a great finding as well. And in terms of gender, we had 78 women participants, 25 men, and 2 non-binary participants. In terms of ethnic and cultural backgrounds, there were 23 First Nations participants, including 2 Torres Strait Islander peoples, and 3 were born in Oceania, 25 were born in Asia, 8 born in Europe, 7 in Africa, and 5 in the Middle East, 3 in South America, and 3 in the Indian subcontinent. There were 6 Anglo-Australians and 6 Celtic Australians. 16 did not specify their home country. We only used place of birth as one indicator of people's cultural identities, of course, because it's really difficult to try to, define what that means to them. And of course, we didn't force them to identify their home country. Therefore, some people just choose to, not name one country as their home country. This is kind of a, reflection of both the complexities of, what is meant by transcultural identities, but also it's just a reflection of how I guess, complicated conceptually the issue is. However, one, very positive and clear piece of evidence is that these transcultural identities of our participants are driving their intellectual history, which they then embed in their doctoral research, and hopefully to a larger or greater extent after our interview. Yeah. So there are some of the key findings about this part about life history and time mapping. So Maria talked about the policy analysis findings, and Catherine and I are going to look at some of the key findings about our life history and time mapping approach. So first of all, we noticed that there's clear evidence that this approach actually enables a semi-structured and multi-sensory way of deep sharing between supervisors and candidates. And there are two publications on this. One is about our original pilot study, version of time mapping, which is a little bit of a two-dimensional, but coming onto three-dimensional. Yeah. And then Maria has actually been working on another second version of the time mapping approach, on the three-dimensional version of the time mapping approach. And then our student Jiao, as Catherine mentioned, is looking at the incorporation of sound and music and rhythm, into the time mapping approach. So it's really going in the multisensory way. So because it's semi-structured, it's informal, so it doesn't actually feels like a very supervisory kind of approach. It feels more like a relation building approach. So you can see that we feel like, this approach is shaping doctoral research and supervisory relationships. So it's shaping doctoral research because it helps participants, supervisors and candidates to talk about, how you have got here, how we have got here, to our PhD, and what part of our personal histories, either it's your cultural practices, the places you were born, and then your migrant experiences, how have all of these, or even travel experiences, and how have all of these experiences actually made a researcher themselves? And how are you going to, or how maybe these kind of experiences might help you mobilize some of your cultural, linguistic, and geographical and historical knowledges, and inform and shape your research topics and research processes and research design, for example. And of course, by sharing all of these personal histories and cultural histories, it then builds the relationship between supervisors and candidates into a really, really empathetic, knowledge co-construction kind of relationship. Yeah. So we also noticed that this approach enhances empathy because of that, and it gives the students a lot of confidence in their own backgrounds, and it gives a lot of confidence for them to extend their cultural voice and linguistic voice, and builds opportunities for transcultural connection. Yeah. So we looked at an approach which is called a histories of knowledges approach based on that, and we found that, our participants are using life history, but also particularly time mapping approach in the way that sci-fi's kind of conceptualized time travelers, right? Yeah. So we found that our researchers are actually, our participants are like time travelers, and they're traveling through the intersections of macro, meso, and micro histories. And they're using a histories of knowledges approach to access all of their knowledges in order to enrich their doctoral supervision and research. Okay, so that is finding one. And finding two is what we are looking at is, because we have learned a lot from the First Nations understandings of relationality, intergenerational, and also intercultural knowledge building. And we found that by, using these different First Nations knowledges to energize our approach, all candidates could actually benefit from learning the First Nations approaches to, or knowledge approaches, let's say, to doctoral education. And we found that these are great to build solidarity, reciprocity, and connectedness in supervision, and to sustain and nurture First Nations and transcultural doctoral candidates. One of our chief investigators, Catherine Gilby, and I used to say old cultures talk to each other, and we find that transcultural candidates, they come here and then they really connect with these First Nations principles of relationality, and that is a great approach that we think that contrasts with the neoliberal social imaginaries of competition, self-interest, instrumentalism, and autonomy that currently dominate Western doctoral education. Actually, before I started this presentation, I was actually looking at my email, and there was a newly published piece of research, not from me, but from somebody else. It says the violence of the the title is The Violence of Doctoral Education in that particular neoliberal model of competition and self-interest. And I think our research findings really speak back, to that. Okay, and I'm gonna give it back to Catherine.
Thank you. Okay. So, some of our other findings were, so this is the paper that Maria has led, which is currently under review. So the time mapping was developed into SAND time mapping by a group of Aboriginal participants, supervisors and students, and draws on that every when conceptualization of time as it involving the past, present and future all wrapped up together, and draws on the traditional practice of three-dimensional earth-drawn artefacts. The every when artefacts were produced by female participants, which were unpacked to illustrate how this creative methodology can be used to assemble and share memories, narratives, deep history, and faraway futures. And the article that Maria led was talking about the three key Australian knowledge learnings, that everything is connected, that Indigenous knowledge is a gift, and that Australian Aboriginal country is the teacher of the curious mind. So that's under review at present. And then a second paper that is also under review at the moment is looking at counter-imaginaries in doctoral education. And I think I presented an earlier version of this in the research conference that we had here at UniSC last year. But we are trying to challenge those dominant neoliberal doctoral education imaginaries by foregrounding the counter-imaginary of First Nations storying, and this draws on the work of Bunda and Phillips. First Nations epistemic imaginary has the potential to produce ecologies of affect characterised by connectedness, reciprocity and solidarity. And this paper explores the opportunities and obstacles that exist in attempts to introduce counter-imaginaries and alternative effective ecologies in doctoral education. So that's the list of publications either published already or, no, they're the published already, and there are a few more that are under review. So passing back to Jing again.
Right. Yeah, so we also produced case studies of life histories because we've got 105 interviewees, and it was really hard to present everyone as a case study, but also we were kind of aware of the copyright issues. If anybody knows a trick about that one, please let us know. So we decided on 18 case studies, which I will later show you guys on the website. And these 18 case studies encompass participants like First Nations elders, First Nations doctoral candidates, First Nations supervisors, but also non-Indigenous and migrant or what we call transcultural candidates and supervisors from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, and then there will be we put our 41 time maps on the time maps gallery on the website, which I will show you as well. And notably, we also produced 2 HDI education resources, one for the life history, the other one is for the time maps, which we will show you on the website later on. And Catherine now will present one of the case studies. Okay.
Oh, that's Maria's one to present.
Oh, that's Maria's one. All right.
So this case study, so this is the time that map that was presented by one of the participants, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander man named Matthew. And during the process, Matthew talked about how he, in particular, was supervised by non-Indigenous supervisors, and he actually was supervised by 2 Irish supervisors, and talked about the solidarity and the confidence that they brought to the supervision process. And so it was an amazing experience for him, because I guess being able to see the impacts of colonisation, but then this resistance, and to come together as a group of 3 in this space to move forward. His work, this is a reflection of his own history in terms of where he came from and the impact that his ancestors had made, and how he could see his own work now as a PhD and actually as a graduate now, moving forward to continue this legacy on, in terms of making sure that there were spaces and voices for Indigenous people in Australia. So his work was really fantastic. And for me, the big takeaway there was understanding the relationship with his supervisors and how they actually not only gave him confidence, but really bolstered and pushed him to do more than perhaps he thought was actually going to be possible, and his sense now of having left a legacy for his work.
This time map is produced by an African supervisor and student who spoke about developing transcultural identities and intercultural skills through education. So his story is really interesting. He comes from Ethiopia, from a small rural community in Ethiopia. At each stage of education, he's moved out into a wider sort of world at each level. So he completed his primary education in his home village. He also completed traditional Ethiopian education, as well as the Western style primary education. Ethiopia has an ancient and really amazing 4 levels of education going up to higher education that goes back many centuries. So then he moved to a larger city to live with his aunt and uncle and do his secondary education. Then he moved to another city in Ethiopia for his undergraduate degree. Then he moved to the National University in Ethiopia for his first postgrad degree. Then he went to the Netherlands, to Denmark. He went to Denmark and struggled with the cold there, and also with the fact that there were not many African people. So he said there were just not many people like me, and it was really challenging. But he said there he met people from all over the world, and he started to develop those kind of intercultural skills. So he said when he moved to Australia, it was not as much of a hurdle, partly because it was warmer in climate, but also because there's a large African community in Australia. So he wasn't feeling quite as lonely. He's gone on to have a really amazing academic career. And so he's represented his time map as a map of the world with all of these different people, and how he has made these ever increasing sort of outward journeys to build these transcultural identities and intercultural skills, and to retain the strength of his identity as an Ethiopian man, but also to develop these transcultural identities as well. Okay, and then it's back to Jean for our official project website launch. And I just want to say a special thank you to Jean and her colleague Lucia, who has done a huge amount of work on the website.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Maria and Catherine. Yeah. So we actually briefly talked about our website when we were presenting in South Africa, but it's only proper, I guess, to actually launch this project on the Gabi Gabi country, because our project has really been inspired by, you know, the stories and the peoples, the, you know, mountains and oceans and the kangaroos here. So we want to, we want to officially launch the website here. That's why. However, we also, you don't know that, you know, the First Nations communities are not homogeneous in terms of languages, for example, and in terms of different cultures as well. So we have used one time map from a First Nations doctoral candidate on the Darug country as the background picture. Yeah, so this is Annie Daly's, one of her 7 time maps. Okay. All right, so our project, this is the web address. If you look at the acronym, it's actually Deadly Doc Ed, so Deadly Doctoral Education. Okay, all right. Okay, yay, launched. Okay, yeah. All right, yeah. No, just very happy because we've been waiting for this year for 4 years, haven't we? Okay. So yeah. So if you just kind of browse through, you will see this is the project summary here. And let me see. Okay, so these are also 2 First Nations time maps from the desert mob in Alice Spring. Yeah. And then this is our Deadly Research team, again with our New Zealand Aotearoa colleague and South African colleagues. And here is a taster of the time maps, but you will be able to click in to explore more and then see the time maps galleries. First, you can look at the resources for how to use time maps to create a sense of belonging and inclusion for HDR students. And then you can click into each one of them and read their narratives as well. Yeah, so I think probably 2/3 of our participants who created time maps indicated they want to use their real names, and 1/3 either chose a pseudonym or asked to choose a pseudonym for them. So this is our Professor Auntie Sue's time map, if you want to have a read of that. And I'll give you an example of this one, for example. That's a student from Southeast Asia. Okay. So it's a particularly interesting sort of PhD study that he is doing. With this student and another student, we actually caught them as our participants in the first 2 or 3 weeks of their study. And, you know, of course, they had to write a research proposal and work on it with their supervisors in order to, get in. So they already have a pretty good sense of what they are looking at. And they were both saying that, the time mapping approach at the very beginning helped them really visualize what they want to do and then pin down their research focus, but also encourage them to look back to their local country or cultural concepts and metaphors and images and all the theoretical resources that they could later on draw on in their research. And that was a great finding, that we thought, time mapping is best actually used at the beginning of the HDR supervision. But of course, it can be used iteratively later on to keep building that research relationship. It's just in terms of, how time mapping can actually help from the very beginning of your doctoral journey to foreground those different kinds of knowledges. We find that the first 2 months is the best point to actually, to do that, to do time mapping. Because later on, when you try to change the direction or the research design of your doctoral research, it becomes a little bit time poor. You become a little bit time poor, right? Yeah. Okay. So there's more if you want to explore. These 10 people, and that's Maria. We found that people have different styles of conceptualizing their own intellectual histories, and their narratives will tell you why, and you can have a look at that. Okay, so this is the life history part. Again, the resource for doing that. And here are the 18 case studies that you can read. We have only created short versions, like 500-word short versions of life histories for, like I said, copyright issues, but also kind of for data privacy of our participants. And here are the publications, including the academic publications, and also the 2 resources here. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jing and Maria. I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll all move down to the cave and to the art gallery that we've set up. Any questions or Claire? Yes. Oh, we need the mic. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I had the real pleasure of getting to do one of these. And so I'm just wondering about this as a method, and you're saying to use it. Yeah, I think it's hugely important and significant. Is this something that you have developed? Is it a model that you were drawing on from elsewhere, or kind of both, where you've iteratively developed this skill? That's my question.
Okay, yeah. So, so our original pilot project developed the methodology. The idea of time maps comes from Zerubbabel and his work, although he used sort of bar charts and more mathematical ways of representing. And I was, a group of us, so myself, Jing, Michael Singh, and Tracy Bunda, we looked at those, but we felt it wasn't, creative enough and flexible enough, and also being someone who's sort of, I regard myself as mathematical, so beyond maths. Convenient, but true. And so we wanted to make it a more visual, artistic kind of representation. And we also had dreams that it could turn into dance. And Zhao has added a musical element. So it was something we developed in the pilot for the study. And we actually have used this methodology in workshops around the globe, in Rwanda, in South Africa, in many other locations, China. And when we were in China, we met a lot of Belt and Road, as they're called, students, and they were from all over the world, and use these to prompt these kinds of narratives and kind of interrogation. Yes.
And it's a self-awareness. That was the most amazing thing, collecting the data, was starting with the questions, and about 15 minutes in, you saw that person have that realization that in their childhood or an experience they had that was critical, was actually the seeds of the research that they were doing and how they came to be. And the supervisors could see that as well, because often there was this sense of, my research is over here and it is separate to who I am, rather than that it is a reflection of who I am. So through that process, it was, for me, I think that was probably the most rewarding part of it, was to see that self-awareness come in. And then I guess that's what makes the methodology so powerful, is the sharing of that, where the supervisor themselves realizes too what brought them to them, or even their interest in the student's work itself might have been rooted in some life history experience.
Yeah, and Maria, do you want to talk about how you iteratively did your time
Oh,
lapse?
yeah.
Because that's really interesting story as well. Yeah.
Well, as I say, resistance is emancipation. So I'm probably a good example, because when I first started this, I wasn't familiar, I might just stand up here, familiar with the method. And so as a part of our, I guess, learning before we went out and collected data, undertook it. So the first time map, I guess, and life history was actually one saying, I'm not going to give you anything. I did write it very poetically, though. I look back and it was quite written. So it was really about 3 paragraphs of saying, I'm not going to tell you anything. It's none of your business, whatever. You know, I'm not going to bare my soul, and I'm not going to, and who are you to ask, and all of this. It is actually, I should get it out one day. And then as the project went on, it moved through from, you know, complete and utter resistance to, I'll tell you this much, a little bit more, and maybe that much. But also for me, it was the boundaries for me were around whose story I could tell. I can tell my story, but I didn't feel comfortable sort of telling the story of my mum or other relatives too. So I think that that's a part of this exploration too, of the boundaries of self in it. And so as it went on, there were just slight iterations over time and over time. So I think in the end, it was probably about 5 of them, because that evolving nature of it. And I think that's a really important thing for conducting the work, is to let people know that it's not static, because there is that, often putting the sort of map together, you sort of feel that, you know, it's set in stone. It's like, no, this is just the first iteration. And as time goes, you reflect on it, and you might share more or you might share less. And I think it just reflects the human experience at the end of the day. But yeah, I probably went from the extreme of, I ain't telling you nothing, to all right, then I'll give you a bit.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks. Any other questions?
I have a follow-up question to that, because you've talked about the students, and I'm sitting beside Claire and I've been looking at her map as well. I was also just checking to make sure the list of publications has links, because I'd been gathering the papers from the slides, and then I was like, oh, the whole list's there. But so the students, obviously, you like talking about the identification of that seed, and I often describe it as the stone in your shoe, you know, that thing that kind of bothers you. But what about supervisors? How did the supervisors' time maps differ from the students where they're talking about that journey? Because Claire's is very much about, you know, how do we as supervisors facilitate the understanding or unpacking of that process?
That's a really good point. And we encourage supervisors to do their own time map as well. And it's actually quite a useful experience, because, as Maria was saying before, you start to realise actually why you're here working in this space on these particular topics. But also then the student learns more about yourself as well. And then together you notice the similarities and differences across time and geography and culture and history, etc. So it's a kind of conversation starter, but also a kind of reflective process for supervisors as well. Yeah.
I think we can get sometimes, you know, when we onboard students as well, we get that lovely little checklist of, you know, on a rating of whose role is this and whose responsibility is that. It becomes very instrumental, and the relationship really doesn't build from that. Whereas this actually is, if you like, a far more intimate way of building this and understanding, because it was a sort of, a lot of times as supervisors, we don't share why we do what we do with our students, because we're seeing, I guess it's that whole neoliberal sort of, you know, pushing people through the process and making sure that things are done on time and all the forms are filled out and all the rest of it along those lines. So what I saw about this was it was way back to relationality. It was not just the student sharing and being vulnerable, but it was the supervisor having that vulnerability to share back. And sometimes with supervisors, they had a bad experience. And so that's actually what shaped their supervision process itself, was to say, well, I know what it was like. So now I'm going to do all these sorts of things to help make sure that this is a positive and rich relationship. As we know, often our students are with us for a very, very long time. And after they graduate as well, we still have an investment in their future, in their life. And they often will look back and hopefully with a positive view of the supervision experience they had. But in some ways, this gave a creative outlet for the supervisors I interviewed as well. It was an opportunity to, I guess, look at their supervision in a sort of less linear and sort of instrumental form filling, checking out function. It was more actually through, it was hearts and minds. It wasn't just minds.
Jean, did you want to say?
Yeah, I was just it reminded me of your question. Thank you very much. Reminded me of one time when Kathleen, Michael, and I were in China, and we decided to do a because Michael was my or is my research supervisor, PhD supervisor. So we decided to sit together and really map out what I call the meso history of knowledges, right? In that histories of knowledges model. So basically, when Michael was born and his key life milestones, and then when Catherine was born, and then the key intellectual development milestones in her life, and then my own. And for example, what's happening, and so that is our meso kind of history. That's our micro kind of history. But then we map that against the history of our team, when we formed as a team, when we achieved a first milestone for this research project. And then we mapped that against the history of our institutional sort of, time. For example, when I came to Western Sydney University had some kind of policy that really shaped my doctoral research. And then we mapped that against the national policies, for example, in Australia, in China, what actually shaped my personal identity. For example, in the 1980s, when I was born, China had the one-child policy, and that shaped a lot of my pedagogical preferences, for example. Yeah, so you use that approach of micro, meso, and macro approach, and you do that together. But I only did that after I graduated. So there is a little bit of a difference there. When you encourage supervisors to do it together, they've got to be very open-minded. So it's very, very, I guess, helpful for supervisors to be really open-minded about, or to be very open, let's say, about their own intellectual histories, and then use that to encourage their students to do the same, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Jean. Time for one more question. If there is one more question. Yes. We need to pass the microphone for the online people. Yeah, thank you.
So you've touched on this a little bit already, but I wanted to get a bit of an understanding of 4 years ago. What was the original inspiration and motivation for the team coming together? What did you hope to achieve? Did you know you were going to achieve what you're doing now, or was there just like a seed of an idea?
Well,
Sorry,
that's
I'm just after that seed of an idea.
And you're talking to an historian, so I could go on for quite a while. No, I won't, I promise. So basically, so I had researched this area for a while, particularly looking at the experiences of international students in doctoral programs in Australia. And I came to the conclusion after writing a book in 2014 that as a white settler Irish Australian woman, I couldn't do this work alone anymore, that I had to research this with other colleagues. And so Michael Singh was a long-time colleague of mine. He's a Punjabi Australian man, and he's done a lot of work in multilingual, transnational education, a lot of work with China, etc. And so he and I started working together. And then I was an examiner for one of his students, who was Jing. And Jing, actually, we've written a book chapter recently about this, but called Entangled Relationality. But Jing's thesis was amazing. It was still one of the best I've ever read. And after I examined it, I said to Michael, I have to meet this Jing because I want to work with her. And so Jing became part of the project. And then we decided we couldn't really, because we were drawing a lot on Indigenous and First Nations philosophies, theories, knowledges, and we're like, well, we can't do that without a First Nations colleague. So we approached Tracy Bunder. And then when it came time to do the application for this grant, Tracy was unfortunately quite busy with lots of other projects. So we invited Maria to join us, and also Catherine Gilby and Auntie Sue Stanton. And so we grew there. And then we had our 2 PhD students. So we have Zhao Tuxworth, whose other name is Meng Jiao Wang, who's a Chinese colleague, and her thesis is under examination. And then our bachelor student, our Indigenous student, is a Torres Strait Islander uncle. And that's really interesting because we have to show him a great deal of respect. So in a sense, he's supposedly, in the Western way of thinking, the most junior member of our team, and yet he is one of the elders who we have to show a lot of respect to. And so it changes the dynamic, doesn't it? You know, when you recognise an uncle as one of the students. And so I guess early on in the project, I think Maria developed that lovely map that she has with the pillars and the circles and all of that. And yeah, I think that I'm hoping that we've achieved what we set out to do. Does anyone want to say anything? I think we have, actually.
It coincided with the times that Catherine had joined USC, I always get it wrong, 2018.
Yes,
and
yes.
so we'd actually coincided because we just merged our two small, we had 2 research centres at the time, the research theme, Indigenous studies theme, and the then First Nations transcultural pedagogy.
Something, yeah.
So at the same time that we were literally forming the ITRC was when this project came along, which sort of fits. And as you can see, the project really is a reflection of what we're doing in the centre, at being at that space that respectfully brings together First Nations and transcultural people. So it sort of was a natural fit. I think
Yes,
it just
absolutely.
was serendipitous in many respects. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. All right, so we're going to take you all down to the cave now and have a time mapping journey, you know, in sound and in sight, I guess, to put it. Oh, we're leaving our people online. Are we able to show them? No, not really. People online, thank you for coming along. We will take photos so that we can send them to you. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone here. And we'll move down to the cave now.